Spirituality and sexuality. This is Chris speaking. Wake up with a video about spirituality and sexuality. Does it have anything to do with each other? Sex and the search for truth. First of all, it is very important to know two things. Firstly, that sexuality is mostly procreation. The reason why we do this, why we can do this, is so that the human race doesn't die out, that we have children and so on. Like any other animals, because that's what we are, animals. Mammals, to be exact. Like cows and elephants and dolphins and so on. Everything else in that area that is not about procreation, not about having children, is cultural. It's not human, it's not the same for everyone, it's cultural. I say it again because most people don't know this and most people have never thought about it, and most people will also have resistance against it. But it's true. Everything in sex that is not about procreation is cultural. It's different from culture to culture. The reason why this is not obvious anymore is that right now the whole world, the whole of humanity, is dominated by one culture. There are some subcultures which are slightly different, but actually it's one big culture that is not aware of the laws of nature, and that is all about expansion and war and growth, like a cancer. And this also influences the views and practices of sexuality, which also become more and more aggressive and alienated and unconscious. You cannot even reduce it to patriarchy, which is a part of this culture, but this alone is not all. A culture of war will have aggressive sex and not emotional, sensuous, natural intercourse. A culture of war will have a lot of rape victims, a lot of rape victims. But not because men are pigs, but because of the culture. In war, in this culture, rape is allowed. And we are in a constant state of war, so it's more or less allowed. Same goes for slave trade and human trafficking. It's allowed in a way that no one does anything against it. But that doesn't say anything about humanity and doesn't say anything about men or women. It only says something about our culture. In our culture, women don't know what it means to be a woman, and men don't know what it means to be a man. Both men and women are alienated from their body and their emotions. And of course, even more so from their gut feeling and intuition. And as I said before, from the laws of nature. We don't know anymore what the laws of nature are. And those few peoples, those few tribes who still live this way are looked down upon as primitive. Well, every natural tribe that still exists, there are not many left, but those that still exist, they have a very healthy relationship towards the body and their emotions and towards the laws of nature. And they don't know things like rape. They don't even have a word for it, because it's not necessary in their culture. They also don't think they're ugly. Women in those cultures don't need makeup and fancy dresses, and men in those cultures don't need power symbols like big red cars. There's no rape, no prostitution, no child molestation, even no prostitution, be it forced or of free will. In our culture, there are hundreds of thousands of prostitutes in every country, and many of those do it voluntarily. It's just a job for them. And men who go there are not necessarily pigs, but they might just need proximity, intimacy. If they get it there, it's another question. And I'm not defending prostitution here, but in a natural society, it's just not necessary. All these dubious, secret and negative aspects of sexuality that we know so well in our culture, all the way from something horrible like rape and child molestation to something not horrible like nude pics on the internet. All this are just signs that people are not in tune with their body and their emotions, and that our narcissistic and psychopathic leaders have turned the world upside down. Most of our politicians, I would say, are either narcissists or psychopaths, and they also shape the laws, of course, according to their own needs, not to the needs of the population, but their own needs. And what are their needs? Admiration, success, power. This is not something typically human. This is not even something typically male. It's something typically narcissistic and psychopathic. And how does sex look like for narcissists and psychopaths? You use the other person. You use your partner. There's no intimacy. There's only exploitation. And things like human trafficking are taboos that almost no one talks about. Not even in the media. Because it's an intricate part of a sick system. For 2,000 years, slavery has been part of the system and has never been abolished. Not really. It's just part of our culture. Of this one aggressive, warlike culture that encompasses by now most of humanity. But it's not humanity. It's this one culture that started with city building between 2,000 and 10,000 years in the Middle East. Okay, those were the two most important things about sex and spirituality. That mostly sex doesn't have anything to do with spirituality. It's firstly procreation and secondly cultural. Now the third part, because of which you probably watched this video and you're waiting for it, is there a special kind of spiritual sexuality? Some kind of spiritual high achieved through and by sexuality? There can be, but I wouldn't call it spiritual. I would call it natural. Something that most of us have never learned or have forgotten. And people like Osho, who have tried to bring it back into our culture, have been punished severely for it. But it's not spiritual. He just realized that it's missing and that it's natural, so he tried to reintroduce it. And then the last question that is often spiriting around in spiritual and esoterical circles and New Age circles is that it costs a lot of energy. That if you don't have sex, then you can preserve a lot of energy that you can then use for real spiritual practices and purposes. This is BS. This is BS that belongs to our culture. This is fairy tale thinking of a culture that is estranged and alienated from itself. There's no spiritual high and there's no energy loss in natural sexuality. There is energy loss in the perverted and forgotten, unconscious, brutal sexuality of our culture. But not because of things like ejaculation, only because it's divorced from body and emotion. For our culture, sexuality often is something like a pressure valve, to blow off steam. That, of course, that you lose energy and power in that, but not by real intimacy and bonding. Joy and love never cost you energy. And that already brings you to our last question. Love and sex, do they have something to do with each other? Yes, in a natural society and culture, yes. In our culture, most people don't even know what love is. It's all just some form of desire, of longing, of needing, of feeling an emptiness inside, feeling a lack inside, and wanting it to be filled somehow, desperately. So think about it and feel into it. What is your role as a woman in this culture? What is your role as a man in this culture? What does it have to do with your sexuality in this culture? And what does it have to do with spirituality? The connection to spirituality is that if you do trauma healing and if you want to get to a liberated life and a liberated existence, you have to deal with sexuality because it's part of your trauma. You have to find your way back to your body, to your physical sensations, and to your emotions. That's it. You have to do this anyway to achieve liberation, so you might just as well have a look at this aspect as well. Okay. Thank you for joining me on Facebook and Patreon. Thank you for all my Patreons. Thank you for liking and subscribing and hitting the bell button and sharing the videos with your friends. And see you soon.